Welcome to the fourth episode of Geopolitics with Alex, and it's been quite a rough week out there on the Ukrainian front. Many things happening. First of all, the Ukrainians were successful in bombing the Kherson Bridge and cutting off some of the supply chains from the ground to the Crimean Peninsula. The Russians counterattacked, which had been planned allegedly for a longer time, hit a lot of civilian targets. We've seen a lot of hybrid warfare taking place as well, not only, of course, the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines, but also communication and other crucial infrastructure. There's been a lot of threats about the use of nuclear weapons. Looks like the mobilization of Russian troops is still a disaster. The figures that we're seeing and hearing are something to the effect of 200,000 mobilized and over 700,000 that have escaped the country. We're also seeing for the first time critical voices emerge in Moscow about Putin's leadership. But of course, the icing of the cake was Elon Musk. With all due respect, I am not sure that Elon Musk understands Putin, understands Russia, but allegedly he had a conversation with Vladimir Putin 2 weeks ago and in his wisdom came out with a peace plan, talking about giving the Crimean Peninsula to the Russians, allowing the Russians to hold on to the territories that they've already taken, and calling for neutrality of Ukraine. Now, I leave it at that because I have a wonderful guest to discuss all of these matters with me today. Warmly welcome Nathalie Tocci, who not only holds a PhD from the LSE with the same supervisor, William Wallace, that I had, but she's also the director of the Institute for International Affairs of Italy, and I think one of the most astute commentators that we have on the war. Let me hear your take on Elon Musk first.
Well, firstly, thanks, Alex, for having me here. And indeed, when I heard about this, I'd obviously seen Elon Musk's tweet, and kind of when I saw it, I was like, where has this guy been living? But beyond the, I think sort of the obscenity of what he was proposing almost comments, itself on alone. But really what struck me was something else, was why is this happening now? And of course, beyond the fact that, as we know, the Putin-Elon Musk conversation was put out by Ian Bremmer, but the point is that this has really been echoed by the Russians and Russian propaganda, and I heard about it, sort of actually yesterday evening, when I was sort of finishing up an editorial for La Stampa, and they phone me up and they say, have you heard about Elon Musk? And maybe actually there is a mediation going on. And as we know, a country like Italy, which is so subject to Russian propaganda, it gives you a sense of why is it that the Russians are actually pumping up the story in this way? What is it that they're trying to achieve? And so on the one hand, we see what is happening on the ground, which is, I think, one side of the desperation that Russia's in, but this other sort of odd Elon Musk story, I think, is the flip side of that desperation.
Yeah, and this is, I think, an example where Russians have been really good at disinformation. We saw that before the war started. They had a capacity to use their trolls and push information and call mayhem, elections in the US, Catalonia and different kinds of places, and sort of throwing this narrative that the West is bad and decadent and the rest of it. And now it's succeeding in a lot of the key issues here. There is propaganda about using nuclear arms. Now, what's the aim there? It is to scare people. There is propaganda about we're trying to find peace. And to use someone like Elon Musk, who of course is, very powerful, is quite tactful. But let's go back to the beginning of the war. We've discussed this before. But what's your feeling? What were your sentiments when the war began on the 24th of February? Did you think it was possible?
Well, I had been of the view, since November that something was going to happen. In all frankness, I didn't think it was going to be a large-scale invasion. I thought it was going to be a sort of Georgia on steroids. But, I think that the deeper point here is that the minute in which this did happen, it did really make me reconsider. You know, I have been, I guess, you know, a sort of Italian academic analyst looking at things over the years. And, you know, I've always been of the view of course, you know, Russia is becoming increasingly big, bad and ugly. And yet, you know, we need to pursue engagement. And hey, maybe there is some truth behind Russia's security concerns. And hey, maybe NATO did overstep its mark. So that was the kind of background that I came from. And all of a sudden this happens. And I was like, I was wrong. And, you know, the fact of kind of admitting to myself that I was wrong, I found actually was incredibly empowering. And you know, obviously beyond, you know, how did I feel? Well, I mean, I was devastated like we all were. And, you know, this real sense of I need to do something about all of this. And, you know, since February, actually, we've been hosting at home a refugee family. But there was, you know, from on the professional side, there was this kind of real sense of, on the one hand, humility about getting it wrong, which actually came alongside a kind of refound sense of empowerment, because it really gives you a sense of freedom, admitting that you can be wrong and you can change your mind.
Yeah, it's very much the Adam Grant thesis, think again, that when you're wrong, you sort of realize that you learned something. And you know what, I had a very similar sentiment, and I say this as a Finn. Yeah, I was always, you know, pro-NATO, and, you know, I was quite tough and harsh sometimes with my language with Russia, but I had this sentiment of idealism and realism. Idealism in that I really bona fide wanted to integrate Russia into the system. You know, I did, when I was in politics, decisions linked to the Nord Stream pipeline. I was involved in those decisions. Yes, I said there's a security issue, but I also played it down and said it's an environmental issue. We did some stuff on nuclear. We wanted to build some more. We thought, okay, let's use a Russian reactor. With hindsight, those were mistakes. It's humbling, sometimes, yeah, I guess empowering as well. Now, let me come then to the point. What do you think would have happened if Zelensky and the Ukrainians would not have been able to hold back on Kiev, and Kiev would have fallen down in 3 days? Would we be in the situation that we are in right now?
Well, I think we'd be in a far worse situation. I think we would, you know, we could well be in the midst of World War III had that happened. And I think, you know, sort of Ukraine and Zelensky specifically will really go down in history as, in many respects, someone that saved for sure the European continent and possibly much more. Because, you know, indeed, you know, when the war started, there was this sense of, on the one hand, you know, how are Ukrainians going to react? And even if they were to react, are they going to be able to hold up? And of course, as we know, one of the reasons why they weren't supplied soon enough with the weapons they needed was because, in this respect, there was actually a failure of intelligence. So you have this paradox of, on the one hand, you know, particularly thinking about US and British intelligence, this incredible accuracy in predicting literally, you know, to the minute when the invasion was going to start. And yet there's, on the one hand, overestimation of Russia's military capacities, you know, and we're seeing that overestimation now, but also underestimation of Ukrainian capacities. Now, had this not happened, you know, had actually that intelligence, that wrong intelligence been right, where would we be now? Well, given that, you know, as I think has now become amply clear, this is not a war that Putin started because of those security considerations. This is an ideological war. So what is it that would make us believe that he would have stopped? And hence, we would have been probably in a World War III scenario. Yeah, no, and it's sobering to say. I mean, two people that come to mind right now. One is long-term, and that's Bill Burns, the director of CIA. He called this early on, and of course this was very much an operation of American intelligence being open and telling the rest of the world, this is what's happening at the moment. I actually heard that someone had been in the headquarters of the CIA last fall, and already in September there had been a billboard which said 9th of February 2022. That's when Russia is going to attack. So whether this is true or not, I don't know, but I think, you know, Bill Burns has been the major tactician. Second person, this week, actually, we saw a speech by Josep Borrell,
the High Representative of the European Union. And he was very forthright in saying, we in Europe got this wrong. We didn't believe the Americans. We thought that their intelligence was over the top and that Russia was not going to attack. And again, here we come to the point that you just mentioned earlier. It's quite humbling to be wrong and understand. But of course, after that, I would argue that Europe has probably been, I don't know, as united as possible. So two last questions. The first one is on Europe. Are you happy with what we've seen coming from the West or Europe in terms of action and reaction to the situation?
Yes, but it's a yes, but. What do I mean by this? I think, yes, very clearly so. As you say, we are and we have been united, actually surprisingly so, given that actually Russia has been one of the most divisive questions in Europe over the years. I think that if you look at it across the board, whether we're talking about sanctions, whether we're talking about military assistance, whether we're talking basically about the different shapes and forms, on the one hand of support for Ukraine, and on the other hand, punishment, if you like, of Russia, I think that we're basically kind of holding up remarkably well. Now, the reason why I say but is that actually, Putin has acted as the great unifier. Now, so long as Putin behaves like Putin, we're kind of oddly fine, yeah? But let's imagine a different situation. Let's imagine a situation in which Putin starts acting, not very likely, but I think the point I'm trying to make is what this is say about internally, European internal resilience. Let's assume that at some point, Putin, rather than opting for a kind of escalation until the end, opts for, let's at least pretend that we want to make peace. Going down the
like
Elon Musk
ceasefire, yeah.
Exactly, going down the Elon Musk kind of route. Peace. That will be the moment. I think that will be the hardest moment for Europeans, because views will differ on this. And this could happen in the midst of a cold and expensive winter or couple of winters. That is where, there will come a point where we can't simply count on Putin to unify us, and we have to start counting a little bit on ourselves.
Yeah, there's nothing that sort of unites you more than a common enemy, and I think in a spectacular way that's what Putin did. We saw that actually this week also in the European Political Community meeting in Prague, where we had 44 European states coming together to talk about energy and security and climate and other things. And of course, Russia wasn't invited for rather, I think, obvious reasons. In our last episode, we also talked about two black swans. One black swan being a declaration, unilateral declaration of ceasefire coming from Putin. What would we do? The other black swan, a little bit rougher, the use of nuclear weapons. But let's then move to the last question, really. I know this is a little bit unfair. We're both political scientists. We do international relations. We love it. We try to analyze what's going on, and quite often we analyze what has happened. But what are the scenarios for you in this? How do we end this war? And when can we end this war? And don't worry, we won't hold you accountable if you're wrong. We'll just liberate you from it.
So I think that out of those two routes, the unilateral ceasefire route, the kind of I pretend to want peace, and the escalation route, I think that the latter is more likely. So the question is, how does the latter play out? Now, at the moment, I think that again, it feels really odd to talk about things in this way, but I think we're relatively lucky, because Putin probably thinks that his strategy can still work. And his strategy, I think, is made of two things. On the one hand, quantity trumps quality in conventional terms. Yes, indeed, obviously, Western arms equipment are far more effective, efficient, but hey, I just need to throw more stuff at this problem, more missiles, more people, and eventually I will win the day. And we see this kind of playing out on the ground. On the other hand, politically, it is basically everything that happens in the unconventional field. And the aim is not military, the aim is political. Whether this is breaking Ukrainian will, whether this is breaking us as Europeans or transatlantically, this is very clearly what the strategy is. Now, I say this and because I think so long as he thinks that he can win this way, dreadful as it is, it's kind of not fine, very clearly, but it's not that nuclear option. The point is, when will there come a moment in which it becomes clear that this strategy, to him, because we probably already see it's not working, yeah, but to him, will there come a moment in which he understands that it's not working? And what would he do then? And that's where you get into the nuclear realm, not because it would change the course of war, but because it would be the ultimate act of desperation of, if I lose, everyone else does as well. And I think that, irrational as it is, we can't rule that out. Now, the question to me is, if that happens, when is it going to happen? And how much territory will Ukraine have managed to liberate once we get to that point? And I think that will determine whether, forget peace, I don't think that's kind of an option so long as Putin's around, but will Ukraine have managed to liberate sufficient territory, and we can kind of discuss what that means, in order for this to be a temporary truce, in order to kind of prevent that kind of nuclear Armageddon?
And I think, Nathalie, this is a really good way to end the conversation. Thank you ever so much for joining.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you also to all of you who've been watching. Remember, in the last episode, we talked about a possible ceasefire, which would be transactional peace. Well, on one side, Ukraine would get back the territories that have been annexed, including Crimea. And on the other side, the Russian leadership would escape international courts. I hope that the first still holds, but after the attacks on the civilians this week, I think it's very difficult to keep President Vladimir Putin out of an international court. And to finally say, with all due respect to Elon Musk, I think it's very important that these huge existential issues that we're dealing with right now in war and peace are left to the people who know their stuff. Thank you very much.
America made its declaration of independence.